Alright, before we go ahead and start, let's go ahead and just go around the room as we sometimes have been doing. How was class last week for you guys? Good, bad, indifferent? You weren't there, so you don't know.
I thought it went well.
No?
We had to move a little more quickly
Sure.
than, but it wasn't bad. It was just,
Class went on forever. The clock stood still.
full day.
Well done.
Well, all right. I guess we can go ahead and jump into this week's material. This week, again, we are switching tracks or gears or whatever we're changing, we are changing it this week. And we're hitting the second book of this quarter's study. And we're looking at Ruth. And I kind of wanted to highlight taking another step back and looking at the New Testament and highlighting the significance of these two books, at least some of the characters' significance in the New Testament world. And so right there at the beginning of our little handout, I took us to Matthew 1, and it's verses 2 through 6a, because it's the first half of 6, and then verse 16, in which we see Boaz is the son of Rahab and Salmon, and then Boaz, of course, is the gentleman that gets to, that marries Ruth and has the child Obed, and out of Obed's line we get David, and out of David's line we get Jesus. It's one of those things that I felt like we needed to pull this reading out of the genealogy. Just because the genealogy of David and then the Davidic line is repeated over and over and over and over again throughout the whole Old Testament and even into the New Testament. Ruth even repeats it at the end of it's giving you the genealogy from Abraham to David. But Matthew's genealogy makes careful consideration to pull out it's Ruth and it's Rahab, and these are women who we've talked about this quarter, and they're showing up in the line of Jesus. It's not just the men. If it's the chroniclers, the historians of David's kingdom, the historians coming out of exile, even Luke only records the men and is focused on these are the men, but the stories of Ruth and the stories of Rahab, I think, have that extra added significance to not only the book of Joshua with Rahab, but Ruth has her own book of the Bible, so there has to be some significance there, but it's also significant that she has that she is pulled out in Matthew's genealogy. And so with that kind of in front of us, let's go ahead and read Ruth Chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. If I could get a volunteer who's willing to read.
Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took wives for themselves, Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband.
All right. So there's not a whole lot, or there's a whole lot there. But it's kind of like those little passages where it's just giving you way too much information, and there's not a whole lot that you can really pull an application from. But these verses are significant So I'll open it up to you guys. What were some of the things that, some of the details that are recorded here that stood out to you? And why? Why did it stand out to you? And if nothing, we can kind of talk about how it may have been interpreted by an original audience.
I listened to a sermon years ago, a guy named David Platt, and he did this, I mean, like an hour at a time, just one chapter at a time, and he digs pretty deep into it. But it's interesting because Bethlehem, he'll say things like Bethlehem is its name is house of bread, you know. So there's a famine, there's no bread in the house of bread, right? In the days in which the judges governed, the name Elimelech means God is king, and yet it's tying it into the time of Judges, in which, if you read the previous word, there was no king in Israel, right? And Elimelech, the king, God is king, now leaves and goes to Moab, which has got some sordid history. Like, there's a lot, just,
Sure.
you know, it's interesting to me that there's a lot going on there.
I was thinking specifically of the idea that somebody would leave the promised land. You alluded to it, but I wanted to go on a little bit more. They left their inheritance.
Yeah.
And returned to Moab, of all places. Go back to Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and following. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came up out of Egypt, because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. The Lord your God will not listen to Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you. And on, but, you know, Moab wasn't a good place, you know, from Israel's history, coming through there on the way out of Egypt, and then to abandon the land that you were given, the promised land. So there's kind of some negative portrayal of Elimelech here.
Feeds into the irony.
Sure.
But that's, I mean, even like, I think everything is, in some ways, this was things that you can find in there. It's like Malon and Chilion, both of them. One means sick and the other one means wasting away. You know, things like that, where Orpah means a gazelle. And if you follow that lineage, it's the gazelle is always running away. You just, all of those things are little bitty things that are gonna continue to kind of show up as just, you know, little trails of things that you're gonna see coming to light later on.
Sure. I kind of highlighted some of those things in the notes as well, especially with this idea of how an Israelite audience would have understood this opening of, as Bruce and Chess, you've mentioned, it's not looking good from the Israelite perspective. There's this famine, but then you get this idea of you're siding with our rivals, you're siding with the enemy over Israel in this moment. You are of the tribe of Judah. You are supposed to be our warriors, or the strong men are from Judah, and yet you're rejecting us. You're rejecting this idea of this conquest that this has happened about a generation or maybe 2 generations after Joshua, and so you're sitting there and saying, did our forefathers not fight for this land, and you're so quick to abandon it, and you're going to live with the enemy, and now you're going to marry your sons off to Moabite women, and you are basically cursing your children, their descendants, because, well, now you've made it to where they're bound to someone who cannot enter the assembly of God. And so if we are to abandon, if we are to let our offspring be abandoned and kept out of the assembly of God, you must have no hope of ever returning. And interestingly enough, it is one of those if you're just reading chapter 1 and having that knee-jerk reaction, it's really impactful when you get to the end of chapter 4 and you get who is the grandparents of David, the king of Israel. And so it's one of those, when you look at kind of when scholars think it is, when this is written, obviously David is king or has just become king, been king but is dead. But it's still one of those ideas of, we know what David's father was. He grew up in Bethlehem. You have this relationship with Judah. It's a good, strong family. Well, no, it's a family that had to return from this time in Moab. And so here we are, and now you have, of course, the men in this section have died. And so it is also interesting with David being in this line, or Jesus being in the line of David, which it brings us back to this basically cursed relationship between an Israelite, two Israelite sons and Moabite women. You see, and then Boaz is a child of a prostitute and marries a Moabite woman, and here they are in a key point in the line of Christ. And yet again, we see Deuteronomy outlines this cursing, this exile of the sinful, the outsiders from the blessings of God, and yet it's Christ who replaces our spot in the receiving line of the curses. He is taking on the curses, and this, as we've kind of already mentioned, Mike, you mentioned it 2 weeks ago about the kings being hung on the tree, and I'm sure it came up last week with the kings being hung on a tree and thrown into a cave with a round stone in front of it. At least I brought that up in my class. There's a whole lot of this imagery of what curses are supposed to look like in the Old Testament, and here we see it again crop up in the New Testament. Of it's not because Christ is cursed that he is taking this on, but he is taking our spot and receiving the curses, so that we may receive blessing. But that's kind of where I had for these first couple verses. Did anyone else have anything before we move on? All right. Let's move on to the next section. Would someone like to read verses 6 through 18 for us?
When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
All right. As we have done, what stands out to you guys in these verses?
It's first mention of God.
Up until this point, there was no reference to him whatsoever.
Sure.
It's interesting that Naomi expresses at least something approaching anger with God, disappointment. It's exceedingly bitter to me, and so forth. And you have Ruth, Ruth with no background of Yahweh as God, pledging herself to Naomi and Naomi's God, who Naomi isn't super happy with right now.
With an oath to God. In regards to it.
I think this portion of Ruth kind of gives us a good snapshot of some of the cultural items that are going on this time. Well, first we see kind of the idea of when a woman is widowed, she is to return to her parents' household or to the clan or to the tribe in which there be men to take care of them. At least for the Israelite perspective. And so Naomi is ready to return to the tribe of Judah, to Bethlehem, specifically because her tribe, her clan, her family, whatever is left of it needs to be are the ones that are supposed to step up and take care of Naomi in this time. And it's a little different for the Moabites, but there is some similarities, just based on region and culture. Certain cultural aspects kind of maintain similarities to this time, and even into Jesus' time of, well, we see it when Matthew's trying to decide what to do with Mary because she's pregnant, but it wasn't him, and so it's one of those, well, what, should I just return her to her parents? Well, no, that's not what you're supposed to do, as Gabriel will inform Joseph. It's one of those moments of the Moabites. It's phrased a little interestingly, and it threw me off, and I don't know how many of you guys caught it. But Naomi says, return to your mother's household, which usually when Jews are talking, it's no, return to your father's household. This is my father's house. Return to your, it's always in this kind of dynamic. And I think part of it is, or not just me, but the scholarly debate that I sided with most is because this is referring to some sort of polygamous culture. The man would be considered a head of multiple houses. So to say to a woman, return to your father's house, well, which house? He has multiple wives, he has multiple families, but it's all one man. It's all his houses. And so to return to your mother's house would be a more direct proclamation of, don't just return to some property that your family owns, but return to your parents, return to your lineage. Because it's significant in this time of, well, if they're young enough and they haven't had children, well, we can still get something out of our daughter, and she may be able to marry someone else and we'll receive a dowry price for that. It may not be as big as the first one, but we can still receive something in this dynamic. But Naomi says, no, you need to return to your mother's households. Don't stay with me just because I was the mother of your husbands. Your husbands are dead. And yes, there's the cultural aspect of, well, if the son dies that you were supposed to be married to, well, you'd marry the younger brother. Well, we even see it in the English tradition. That's how King Henry's first wife is pledged to him is, well, his older brother died, and so it became Henry's wife when he became of age. And so you still see some of that even here of Naomi saying, I'm not going to have kids anytime soon, let alone 2 sons for you to marry. And even then it will be at least 18 years before you even think about having a marriage to this son of mine. And even now, if we start adding up the days and the hours and the months and the years, it's going to be way too long of a commitment for you. What good do I offer you? Return to your nation, return to your people, return to your gods, because I have nothing to offer. And Orpah's kind of convinced by that idea. She's convinced of, okay, I was really holding on for emotional, because I feel emotionally obligated. You are someone who I've come to know and live with, and we've had this bond, but you're right. The bond's basically been severed. I can just run away. I can go. I can return to my ways for me. However, Ruth sees it as something far greater. She's clinging to Naomi, and in this moment, in clinging to Naomi, I couldn't help but think of some of those ways of, for Ruth, this is a moment of, here's my ticket out of the sinful ways of my past, the sinful ways of my people, the ways of these gods, and it is my lifeline. I am not letting go of this. And of course, Naomi is bitter. She's bitter for most of Ruth. She's not happy with her situation with God. She's frustrated, but it doesn't make any sense for Ruth to cling to Naomi. But it's still that moment of Naomi's recognizing, this is my way to a better life. And I think we still even see some of this today. We can think of the refugees, whether it's from Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine, South America, China, North Korea, Russia. You start digging around in the news, you hear crazy stories of people trying to escape. They're trying to escape war-torn countries, oppressive rules. They'll do things like hide under trucks. They'll put way too many people on an inflatable raft and try and go out into the Mediterranean Sea. They'll drive SUVs through barbed wire fences trying to get to South Korea. They'll try and do and say whatever they need to say so that they can get a ticket on a plane, and then they can just disappear once they're in an airport. They're trying to just get out of these places. They're trying to get to freedom. And for Ruth, I think she's doing the same thing with God. She's recognizing this God of Naomi, I don't know a whole lot, but I know it's surely better than this thing that I have known. But nothing can be as worse as these gods and these practices. I've seen the destructive nature of them. And I've seen how Naomi has treated me with kindness ever since I've been here. My own people won't treat me with kindness. Surely there's something here. And so I will take a spot as the least of these among the Israelites if it just gets me into a way in which I can follow God. But that's how I was seeing it. What about you guys? I don't want to talk too much because also I'm flying through my notes. So
I think based on her response, she knows more about God than we tend to give her credit for.
sure.
Which means Elimelech and his sons did something right,
Yeah.
even in the midst of leaving Israel.
Even after the fact that this god of my mother-in-law's seems to be not very available at the moment, he's caused famine and all the rest of it, yet he's still a much better prospect than their own gods. I absolutely think that's a key throughout this.
And according to Naomi, he's the reason why Ruth doesn't have a husband.
Mm-hmm.
But she still wants to follow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Says something about her heart.
I think that goes back to the relationship between the two of them, and even the other one, even Orpah. I mean, there's neither want to leave, and I've got to think that's culturally is not the wisest choice. You're choosing a destitute life, no male, period, in any relationship. I mean, we're going back hoping to beg. And that's what's going to happen. They're going to go back and beg and hopefully find family to live with and whatever that may look like. But they're all willing to follow Ruth or Naomi. Orpah decides to go back, but they're all, you know, they don't wanna leave her. There's gotta be something there in terms of relationship.
Sure.
And, I mean, in the rest of the story, she does everything that Naomi says to do. Maybe wise move, but.
It's interesting. You know, we're so insulated from their kind of life, you know, because we have government assistance for this, that and the other. They have nothing. It's like you're saying there, I mean, the prospects were dying. And that's for one woman. So 3 women, you know, and what's the law in Israel? If they're upholding it and teaching it, there's no intermarrying allowed, so your prospects are not good at all. Penury.
And it is interesting, I mean, they're going back because they've heard that the Lord has visited his people and giving them food, right? Like, I mean, it must not be better in Moab, and the chances of getting food in Moab is not as likely for a Israelite and a Moabite who is intermarried.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, we can go back and maybe, and
So
if we part ways, now you're a Moabite, now I'm an Israelite.
you're an outcast whichever way you go.
That's right.
Good point.
All right, we'll go ahead and read our last section. And I can read it. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
I think it is interesting, you know, we started with Bethlehem as the house of bread, has no bread, and now at the end of chapter 1, the house of bread is at the beginning of barley harvest, right? There's this, you go from negative, 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 all things are, it's death, 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 death. It's all bleak, 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 and then there's just a, you get to the top of the negative hill, and it's like there's just a glimmer of hope over there. You just don't know what it is yet. You know, it's just, it's the beginning of barley harvest. Well, might be food. But it is very clear, Ruth the Moabitess, right? I mean, it's, we're making this real clear. Ruth is going into enemy territory. Like, everybody gonna know that that's her, right?
This is also the beginning of a theme that will run throughout the rest of the book, between emptiness and fullness. Eventually, Ruth is going to be the actor through whom Naomi's emptiness is reversed and she is made full. Someone mentioned earlier, Ruth did everything that Naomi told her to do. But when she went to Boaz, I'm getting ahead of the story, but when she goes to him, she actually does more than Naomi told her to do. And the end result is the kinsman redeemer marriage and a grandson for Naomi. And so Ruth becomes the person through whom Naomi's emptiness is turned. in the fullness. And even when the women quote, like there in chapter 4, when they're recognizing all of it, they actually use, if I'm remembering right, they use some of that terminology. The woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." They identify that Ruth is the one through whom Naomi has been restored. You know, in other places in the Old Testament where we see these sort of laments, there's also the idea of the person stating their righteousness and how they don't deserve the hand that's been dealt to them. With that as kind of the background, it's interesting that Naomi doesn't claim any kind of righteousness or this has all been done wrong to me when I don't deserve it. She's just making a statement of, this is what has happened. I don't know what to make of that, if anything. But
Do
it
you
is
think she's
interesting.
fatalistic, or do you think that she knows she's cursed because they went to Moab, her and her husband?
I think that's a question definitely worth asking. I mean, so many things in the Old Testament narrative are obliquely stated. They're around the corner and down the block a little bit, and so you have to make some of those sorts of connections. And other things that we might expect to be there aren't. For example, we don't know which son was married to Orpah and which one was married to Ruth. And that's kind of a natural question for somebody who's reading this more as history to ask. But it's clearly not important to the overall story. The point is, these are Naomi's sons. They were married to these Moabite women. And now we're gonna keep circling until we focus on Naomi and Ruth and how Ruth brings about the redemption of Naomi.
It's interesting to me, I mean, they walk into town, and obviously it says, "So Naomi returned with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter," I mean, they're highlighting that information. But she walks, you know, it gets into that lamentation, so to speak, where it's, is this Naomi? And she goes, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt with me bitterly with me. I went out full, but I come back empty." Well, what is Ruth? Like, still empty?
They're in the same boat.
They're in the same boat. Maybe that's the case. So, you know, but does Ruth take that as a slight? You know, it's like,
Oh, I see where you're going.
you know, like I'm bringing my stepdog here. You know, like, yeah, trailing something behind me. You know, I don't know, but she come back. She's afflicted. You know, she's been afflicted, and that all of that's true. But where does Ruth fit into that equation? Or is it just, it is a lamentation, and it's holistically, I came back, I went off full, 3 men in my life, now I come back and I've got nothing except for a Moabite daughter-in-law.
Who, in some ways, doesn't help her, right? I mean, it's one more mouth,
Socially.
it's one more mouth to feed,
right.
it's a foreigner in her land,
And a Moabite.
but I think what the writer wants us to get is Naomi's mental state. You know, it's not that Ruth is nothing, it's that in the depths of Naomi's despair, she doesn't even see the potential for what Ruth can bring to the table. You know, and so she has this lament.
Well, there's no offspring.
Yeah.
Her only hope is a redeemer.
only hope she's got. And Ruth can't provide that.
Yet.
Well,
Yeah.
if Boaz hadn't been a family and redeemed her, that still wouldn't have.
Yeah.
If Ruth had gone off and got married, that still isn't redemption for her. So, I mean, that's emptiness for her.
And at this
certainly.
point, the prospect of that being a possibility isn't even
No.
registered.
To her, it looks impossible.
I mean, Boaz is trying to shake off the fact that he's the progeny of a prostitute, which is bad enough. And now, is he going to balk at the possibility of redeeming, you know, someone that if he intermarries with could certainly cause a whole lot more problems for him?
A Canaanite prostitute, not even like a foreigner.
Don't rub it in.
Like he's already getting weird looks, and now he will get more. But there also has to be some consideration of maybe it's because of his background that he's put in the place so that he and Ruth are there, and everything works out.
Seems to me that one of the themes of this book is shame.
Sure.
There's a lot of shame in here. There's a lot of people who should be on the fringe, and yet they play two roles. That says to it. That's God all over. That is working with people that are. Can't remember.
So I know you mentioned in the opening, when you went to the genealogies, you talked about Rahab and Ruth. Right? But the other two women in there don't exactly increase the quality. You know,
Yeah.
they don't raise the standard so much. I mean, there's Tamar
Yeah.
who tricked her father-in-law into
She prostituted
sex,
herself.
so she prostituted herself, and then David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba doesn't show up by name in Matthew, but it talks about her as Uriah's wife.
Mm.
You know, and so we have all these questionable things, and it's just that I don't know, it's the great reversal kind of a concept that runs throughout the Bible, where the younger son of the patriarchs becomes the one through whom God works, as opposed to the older one. The barren women somehow have children. The women of ill repute find their way into the lineage of Jesus.
Well, even in the story of Tamar, Judah will say,
She's more righteous
she's
than
more
I."
righteous than I.
Yeah.
And how? Because she was,
Because I withheld from her my son.
that's right.
You know, he knew what he should have done, and he didn't do it. It led to what happened.
Yeah.
What else was, I mean, in one sense, what else was she going to do?
Well, she didn't have a husband because his sons were evil and wicked. That's why God killed him, except for the last one that we know nothing about, because he hit him.
When she was and she was waiting. I mean, she was being righteous in some ways, in that sense, where waiting to be wed to the last one, because that's what she was supposed to do. So that's, that was an interesting story in
It's
itself.
it's just,
Yeah.
time after time after time, you see God doing the unexpected through people you wouldn't expect him to use.
Mhm.
And we just continue having examples of that.
Well, even David himself was the youngest, and when you get into Luke's gospel of or genealogy, it's not even Solomon that he highlights. He highlights Nathan, who's a younger son even than of Solomon, not of Solomon, younger son of David and Solomon. And so it's one of those, we're tracing different lines, and we're still finding the same little outcroppings of these aren't the same. These aren't the people you're thinking would be in the line of the Messiah, the Savior that's supposed to bring forth God's rule. We're picking a whole lot of flawed people.
I mean, if that was my family's genealogy, I know too much about my family's history. They would have hidden all that.
Sure.
That would be under the carpet, and yet God emblazons it for all to see.
Records it for
Point of
all of
pride.
history.
Which then raises the question, why? And we come to the conclusion, God can do what he wants. God is sovereign.
Yeah, he's much bigger than social stigma.
So I don't know what
And
value,
that's a lot of what this is.
I don't know what value there is in this chapter to look at the history of Moab himself, but Moab is the grandson of Lot.
Hmm.
Through an ancestral relationship, I mean, incest.
And the land itself that was given to Lot's descendants was promised by God. In Deuteronomy 2, a couple of places it mentions telling the Israelites to leave the Moabite people alone because God had promised that land to them. And so even the Moabite people, to some degree, have some concept of God's deliverance,
Sure.
being delivered from Sodom and Gomorrah, whether that's a historical story that was passed on generation to generation for them or not. I mean, it would kind of blow my mind if they didn't share that
Yeah.
generation to generation, but at the same time, they also didn't look back to see that. But anyway, I thought I'd share that. I don't know if there's what value there really is in here. It is one of those repetitive things that we see over and over again in the chapter, mentioning Moab and Moabites and Moabitess. So,
Sure.
I think, and just to, highlight that, I think the reason why they keep bringing up Moab is to highlight that point. I think there's no reason not to bring it up, even to the very end of that chapter. We already know who Ruth is. You don't have to keep saying that she's a Moabitess or that she's from Moab, but it includes it again. It's like.
It continues to throughout the book.
That's right, it just in chapter 1, the Moab or Moabite or Moabitess is 5 or 6 times. So there's obviously, they want you to, the author wants you to go and have a mindset of, this is going to be hard for her because there's a negative stigma already. Like, she's a Moabitess, she's from this land, she's a Gentile, she's all the things, it is repetitive.
well, and it's similar to Rahab even from that standpoint, that every time Rahab is mentioned, even in the New Testament, Rahab the prostitute. Why do you gotta throw that in there?
Yeah.
Or even the name Rahab. It's not got a good connotation in Hebrew at all, in the early history. The monster that was called Rahab is good for nothing, useless. But God, it was real useful to God.
Yeah.
And I think there's certainly, obviously Ruth and Esther are the only 2 books named after women. Ruth's the only book named after a Gentile. God's view on women is high. Different than what culturally it would have been at the time. And I think that's important to point out. Not politically correct or otherwise, it just is truth. The people that saw him first were women at the resurrection. Their testimony doesn't stand up in court, but yet the Bible is going to mention that
They're
those
the
2 women
first to
saw him.
testify.
Yeah. You've got women have a low view in society, and yet we're gonna name 2 of our books after them, and they're gonna be in the lineage of your main deity. Sounds crazy in social standards, but God operates differently.
There's something else here that I think is important, and that is that Ruth makes a vow. And God is real big on vows. And so the other thing that runs through here is how she sticks to that and fulfills it, and even does add more in some respects.
Sure.
But one of the things I focused on last Sunday was, they made a vow to the Gibeonites, And the fact that they honoured it, in spite of all the pressure from the people of Israel, that was big in God's book. He blessed Israel and he blessed the Gibeonites as a remnant.
And then cursed Israel when Saul
When,
violated it.
exactly, when Saul violated that and killed a bunch of Gibeonites, that vow was still running. It didn't have a time limit on it.
Yeah.
Good point.
This week, I didn't do this last week, but this week we're bringing it back just because we have a little more time. We're not trying to cram 3 chapters in. I don't know what we'll do in 4 weeks when we were trying to cram 11 chapters in, but that one, it's going to be, and then they took this land,
Yeah,
and then they took that land.
I'm quite happy with that arrangement.
Yeah, and but we're bringing this section back, the choose this day, kind of just bringing back that central focus of this study. Over and over again, we are faced with choices, and same with the Israelites, same with now Ruth and Orpah are faced with a decision to stay with Naomi or to stay with. Or to go back to their own people, to their ways of life, to their gods. And the whole book of Ruth hinges on this one decision. And it kind of made me think of that poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And in that poem, we don't really, he describes 2 roads, and one seems good and one seems bad. Doesn't say how they end up. He doesn't say which one he ends up taking, but he says the one he took made all the difference. Likewise, we don't know what happened to Orpah really after she makes her decision. She sits there and says, I'm going to return, and it may have been that was the path that looked the best. That was the path that there was sunshine and there was a golden field to one side and the trees were all nicely trimmed, but that may have also been the path that led to death. That may have been the one that led you back into sin, into destruction, whereas the one that draws you deeper into the woods, that twists around all these trees and has roots and is dimly lit, it's going to be a pain to go down that road, but you're taking the road that leads you to God. Ruth, I think, is taking that path that doesn't seem like it's the one that's going to work out. She's making the decision. Yes, it's going to be hard. I'm going to be moving in with my widowed mother-in-law, and we are going to be changing where we've lived for the past decade or so. We're going to go into a place where I've never been. I don't know truly all of their customs and how they treat widows and beggars, but I'm sure it's not great because no one treats beggars and widows really great during the famine. And I don't know what will happen, but I'm going to make this decision. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I know that that by following Naomi, I'm going to be in some way following God's path for me. I think sometimes when we make our decisions, it's the same decision. It may seem easier to fall into the ways of the world. It's easy for me not to really poke my head out. I can just follow the crowd. I can just not worry. But that's not the one that's leading to God. That's the one that's leading to death. It may be easier at first, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're ending up where you want to end up. Sometimes you have to go over the rocks and the roots and the dark times to get to that point in which you realize I've been brought closer to God by following and making this hard decision that did not benefit me, but in the immediate, but it benefited me in the long run. And so I made a decision that made all the difference. And so that's kind of some of the closing thoughts. And then again, it's the same kind of conclusion or concluding thought of, I don't know I was coached not to talk in my, or not to talk, I'm teaching, so I have to talk. But not to ask questions in my class, by my class. And so I haven't necessarily been asking this question every week. It's especially weird when you get to know who's in my class, because usually they're the ones that love answering questions, but they came up to me and specifically said, don't ask questions. And so it's just one of those, all right. But I haven't been asking this question every week, but I feel like I need to bring it up again this week. So it's that question. I've included it on all of our notes. Think about some of the things that have been keeping you apart from God. What are the things that you're choosing, either knowingly or unknowingly, over God? What can we do to help you as members of the body of Christ? How can we help you battle that demon, or however you want to put it? And how can we pray? How can we help you in this temptation? Because really, again, the focus should be on every day of our lives, every instance we have, we're being asked that same question that we brought up first week, and we'll get back to it at the end eventually. That Joshua asked the people, choose this day who you will serve. And of course, but for me and my house, I will choose to serve the Lord. And so